Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to our second class of Race and Colonialism, a comparative approach. Today we will talk about the legacy of the Second World War and specifically what kind of legacy it left behind in terms of notions surrounding understanding the concept of race and racism, what is a Eurocentric view and what is a more anti-colonial view on the concept of racism. And also we will discuss holistic frames, reparation frameworks for justice, international developments on international law on crimes against humanity, but also how the concept of genocide came about after the Second World War, and how these relate to colonialism and the forgetting of these. So without further ado, I'll first start with the article that you had to read about the double bind surrounding race, where the author of the article was basically suggesting there were two strands of how to understand racism, and one of which became very dominant inside of Europe's memory on understanding race and racism after the Second World War. And basically the author describes that there are two discourses, and one of which became dominant. And basically the discourse says that there's a battle between during the Second World War, there was between liberal democratic societies and fascist Nazism, which was the racist society. And these two, there was like an aberration, something that contaminated the liberal and democratic values of Europe. So that is one strand of thinking about what racism was and is. So more focused on the ideologic aspect and how a party with this strong ideology could have taken power and used the institutions then to further disseminate these racist ideology, which was part of Hitler's Nazism. The other view, on the other hand, which is more dominant in anti-colonial thinkers and more prominent there, is that racism is not understood as an exception or an aberration or an ideology of liberal democracy, but it is inherently part of current modern liberal democracies. And so it's more seen as an institutional framework. The author also called it the technology of empire, so a way to give shape to colonialism as a government instruments, as you've seen before in the course, to legitimize and govern other regions of the world. Racism was an instrument for this, so it's deeply embedded in the institution. So these are the two sort of conflicting views about these conceptions. And I think what the writer also showed is that in the, I see I have a typo there, but in the 1930s and 1940s, that writers were already starting to be more and more critical of racism, but often this was related to the kind of racism of fascism, but not so much as an anti-colonial critique. This was more marginal, but the critical anti-colonial scholars were there, definitely there also in the 1930s, but these were often more or less ignored or didn't spark popular debate surrounding institutional racism, but it was already being conceptualized by different authors. And I think the Second World War, when it came into Europe, the racism and how it affected Europe internally as well instead of other places of the world, it was really seen as an aberration of this liberal democratic values. That was basically the two strands that were given. And I think a really strong impact on the concept of racism after the Second World War, the legacy of it became really illegitimate, basically on an international level. While beforehand it was very normal to organize your democratic society on the basis of race, exclude people from voting rights, etc. There was a UNESCO meeting at the UN level on race in the 1950s and 60s, where unequal treatment of race on biological factors was vanished, seen as not normal, and also it was said that we should organize against racist discrimination. So basically, after the things that happened in the Second World War, racism and understanding excluding people on the basis of race became less and less popular, and normal mainstream on the policy levels. And this had also to do, of course, with the decolonization movements that also had more and more a say in how things gave shape, but still they didn't really, in the popular sense and in the mind and in the collective memory, it did still hide the more institutional side of racism, to see it more as an inherent part of democracy. And I think maybe sometimes a meme explains something well. And I like this meme that shows a picture of a Native American that says, what if I told you that the left wing and the right wing belong to the same bird? Saying you have a democratic and how you say democratic and I forgot the two parts. I can't find the word somehow, but the two-state system in the US, of course, and where you see for them left or right doesn't exist. They're both part of the same system. If it's a left or right government, in both cases they will be appropriated from their land. Their rivers will be polluted and they will face assimilation. So in that sense, they say, like, from the outside, for us, left and right politics look the same. And I think this outsider view, so an anti-colonial view from the view of the oppressed, from the people from the colonies, this is more often said. And I think someone who really puts this into words is Aime Cesaire, which I also quoted during the interview with Chris, who wrote very eloquently on the discourse on colonialism after the Second World War. And he says, the barbarism of Western Europe has reached an incredible high level. And I am not talking about Hitler or the prison guard or the adventurer, but about the decent fellow across the way. Not about the members of the SS or the gangster, but about the respectable bourgeois. They tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. Without being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside of him. He is very explicit about it, that Europe has been exporting a kind of Nazism elsewhere in the same type of racist ideology as Hitler. And I think we also elaborately talked about this with the interview with Chris. But this is really from an anti-colonial standpoint of view. It really focuses more on the institutional side, it being normal in the Western intellectual side. And as I earlier also said, the quote of Toni Morrison also says that it was the system that brought colonialism and slavery that really made possible the horrors of the Second World War. And I think this is really important to understand if we want to really have a critical and anti-colonial look of the institution, not to be, especially in Europe, this is very strong to see Hitler as the evil and we as the Dutch, the English, etc., as the good side of history, while they're kind of the same, they're on the same side of history. If you look at from an colonized perspective, and I think to show these, I have made a little racist quote book for you to watch. I'm not going to read all the racist quotes of these thinkers because it's too long and there's too much. It was so widespread and common. But I did want to give some examples, and you can click on pause on every slide if you want to read them. And I will read maybe 2 examples, but these are all the Enlightenment thinkers that are seen as the fathers of philosophy, of which our institutions stand on, who made the laws and everything. And so I will just start quoting some. So you had John Locke, who's very known. So he wrote on his article into the Constitution of Carolina, at the USA, for instance, that every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his, Negro slaves of what opinion or religion soever. So yeah, he's standing for the, he stands up for the rights of men, but not some men because they are dehumanized. So this was John Locke, or for instance, Winston Churchill who's seen as a hero in the West. This is something he said about the Palestinians and their claim for the rights of their land. He said the following: "I do not agree that a dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to Red Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." Okay, so this was Churchill. Again, if you want to read this one, click on pause. Charles Montesquieu. We have here, John Locke, I already quoted him. Montesquieu, Voltaire, quote from Voltaire. Hit the break button if you like. Quote of David Hume, Immanuel Kant, if you like to read. George Hegel, if you like. So basically the conclusion is that modern liberal and democratic state is the racial state. It was already in its foundation a racialized state, and this was before Hitler the case and after Hitler the case. Racism is just seen in the anti-colonial perspective as a political instrument and as institutional. Okay, so now that we discussed briefly this, different views on how to place racism, I think a very important debate is there also, which is also quite small, and I would say marginal at this time, just like the institutional critique on racism was marginal in the 1930s. I think today you can see that on the notion of how we understand genocide, there has been quite some anti-colonial and decolonial ways of looking at genocide as well, but they have not been popularized, and that makes colonial genocide, I think, the more invisible, because I think next to that liberal democracies have institutionalized racism, they have also institutionalized genocide, and but that depends on how you define and understand genocide. So to explain this, I will have to go to the one who coined the term genocide, which happened in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jewish intellectual and writer, and he wrote about genocide that it is a case of genocide is the destruction not of individuals only, but of a culture and a nation, where he explains that genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group; to the other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition in turn may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain or upon the territory alone after the removal of the population and the colonization by the oppressor's own nationals. So basically he's saying here, what he means with genocide and its two phases is that it's removing a national pattern of oppressed groups and their culture and imposing a colonizer's culture on it. He goes further to explain in this, and I will read this one out because I think often people don't go to the original text. So I thought it was good maybe to quote also the original text of Raphael Lemkin about genocide. This is his piece, a known piece of him, Genocide, a Modern Crime. And he writes the following: Hitler was right. The crime of the Reich in wantonly and deliberately wiping out whole peoples is not utterly new in the world. It is only new in the civilized world as we have come to think of it. It is so new in the tradition of civilized man that he has no name for it. It is for this reason that I took the liberty of inventing the word genocide. The term comes from the Greek word gens, meaning tribe or race, and the Latin word cide, meaning killing. Genocide, tragically enough, must take its place in the dictionary of the future beside other tragic words like homicide and infanticide. As van Roensent has suggested, the term does not necessarily signify mass killing, although it may mean that. More often, it refers to a coordinated plan aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups, so that these groups wither and die like plants that have suffered a blight. The end may be accomplished by the forced disintegration of political and social institutions, of the culture of the people, of their language, their national feelings, and their religion. It may be accomplished by wiping out all bases of personal security, liberty, health, and dignity. When these means fail, the machine gun can always be utilized as a last resort. Genocide is directed against a national group as an entity, and the attack on individuals is only secondary to the annihilation of the national group to which they belong. So he's very explicitly saying here that genocide is not the same. That's not why he invented the term. It's not the same as mass murder. It's destroying a nation state, and thus the second phase, imposing a new nation state and system, and using all means and different layers to gain that. And the machine gun is always as a last resort. So genocide is a different term than massacres and mass murder, which is often in the popular imagination, conflated both. So it's not only looking at biological extermination. And in his piece, he then goes in, okay, which kind of layers in when you institutionalize genocide, what kind of layers of oppression is part of the genocidal machine, the modern machine, that implement genocide. And he looks at political oppression, social, cultural, economic, biological, physical, and so the physical part, the mass killing, is only a sub part of the physical. So it's like religious, moral, everything. So in that sense, the concept of genocide is a bit different than often understood. And I think if you then put genocide in the colonial context, we already discussed that colonialism had all these dimensions of oppressions institutionalized. And if you take Lemkin's definition of genocide, then you could really well argue that colonialism was a genocidal machine because it killed peoples. I think the video that you saw earlier on Schooling the World also really shows this. Like, the Native Americans are allowed to exist on the land as long as they take on the national identity of the oppressor. And this was taken through all institutions would collaborate and were holistically part of this destroying other nations and ways of being. And then you can see the transition that was aimed for. So, and then in the article of Nafis Ahmed, he also goes more on the way in international law and how the UN adopted the term genocide in the end of Lemkin, how the discussion went on this. And he also said, emphasizing that genocide is colonial in nature and was about occupation and settlement. And he warns that, I'll read this part out in the second sentence: rather than projecting the Holocaust back into history as the ideal type of genocide against which all other genocide and acts of mass violence can be compared, Lemkin viewed the Holocaust as an inherent unfolding of the logic of Nazi imperialism and colonialism in Europe. The Holocaust and German Imperium between 1939 and 1945 was for him a continuation of the genocidal occupations that have characterized colonialism through the ages, in an extremely radicalized bureaucratic mode. So I think the quote is clear. And what you see, so the UN adopted at some point the word genocide. There's a convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes of genocide in the UN level. And the first time this got into the UN was in 1946. And basically a lot of the way Lemkin defined this concept was adopted, but it brought about a lot of controversy and a lot of resistance was against this term, it being too broad. So that because of this discussion at the end, and this is how we have genocide now in the UN, there was a new adoption at 1948 by the UN General Assembly. And so to then we had adopted in the UN level the concept of genocide as we have it today, and you can see it right there. And I'm going to highlight the points that Nafis Ahmed puts out in the discussion of what was the difference between the 1946 conception of genocide and the 1948 conception of genocide, and the impact of this differences. So basically, what was excluded first, it said, so racial and national, ethnical, racial, and religious groups are now included. But what was removed was political or any other grounds, so that you could also commit genocide against a political group or any other group and identity. And in the article of Nafis Ahmed, he is also explaining that the identification of a group is never neutral. It always happens in a certain context. And this is also Lemkin talked about in his writings, that a lot of times the instruments of genocide could also be used against people who were organizing themselves or resisting against certain occupation or policies. So in that sense, the identification of a group, and you have many examples of today, for instance in Indonesia, where a lot of communists were killed, or political groups are targeted through genocidal means. Oh, I hear the neighbors are drilling. I'll hope it's short. Yeah, it's gone. So you could see, wait, I'm gonna pause recording for a second. So welcome back. I think they're done. So what I was gonna say, so in the discussion that Nafis Ahmed portrays, genocide can also be committed according to Lemkin, and what was later removed by the UN, by political or any other grounds. And the reason it was more narrowed down is because if you would include this more broad concept into the UN, then a lot of crimes that happened after the Second World War would fall under this convention. I mean, you can imagine if a dictator or a group starts prosecuting political opponents in certain contexts, and this would fall under the genocide convention. You can imagine a lot more prosecutions or could fall under this in international law. So this was removed from it. And another thing that was put in the definition that is quite narrow in the new definition is that it says, in his words, a perpetrator or intentionalist paradigm, because in the UN definition now it says, it has the sentence with intent to destroy in whole or in part, and then all these groups making either national, ethnical, racial, or religious. And for Lemkin, this is also explained in Nafis Ahmed's article, it doesn't need to be an explicit intention to kill a group, to say, okay, I'm going there and there to kill a certain group. That is my intention and goal. It can also be secondary to another goal you have. So maybe you have a motivation to exploit land, and there's people on the land and they start resisting, and then you start identifying and wanting them to kill as a secondary means. So in that sense, genocide can also come as an instrument for other goals or motivations that you have, and that this is also what he shows. And although in international law, I think you can have this discussion as well, but they're just raising the issue of how this putting emphasis on intention might be exclusionary or making invisible other ways in which genocide has been implemented in history and today. So I think, I hope it was clear, to summarize the discussion on genocide and racism. So basically, in both conceptions that are, let's say, not Eurocentric or looking from an anti-colonial perspective, it sees them as integral parts of modern institutions. And they look at various facets of it. And so in this part, I want to talk about, going from crimes to reparations. because I think this is also what happened after the Second World War, right? You have many examples of reparations happening towards the Jewish community. German paid huge reparations. And I think reparations is a normal concept. If you do something wrong, you apologize and you make right for what you did wrong, ethically speaking. And this has also been made in international law, and I'll go into that now. Of course, historically speaking, unfortunately, we have many examples of reverse reparations. I'll call it just for now, is that the wrongdoers got reparations. And I think earlier in the course, you already got to know that master enslavers were compensated for their loss in property of the enslaved after abolition of slavery, instead of the enslaved being compensated for their wrongdoings. So this is a map in Amsterdam, for instance, and every dot is an address of a master enslaver in Amsterdam that got compensated after the abolishment of slavery. Yeah, and another example of reverse reparations is the 1825 when Haiti did a revolution and gained this independence from France. They had to pay, and otherwise they would get economic sanctions from France. They had to pay 150 million francs, today's worth 22 billion, to France as reparations for French loss in property in Haiti. And this took them about 120 something years to pay, and they had to pay interest on it as well. And another example is Indonesia had to pay, for instance, the Dutch for their gaining their independence, 3.8 billion gulden at the time, not euros, for their loss in property. And the Dutch were even so blatant to even ask the cost. They didn't have to pay it at the end in Indonesia, the cost of the politionele acties, their invasion, the bill for that one. And they paid up until 2003. Indonesia was still paying off parts of this sum of reverse reparations. And I mean, this was not only in the Netherlands, also the UK and France compensated master enslavers. So in that sense, reparations is not something foreign or an alien concept, also not to Western countries, only we have been doing it the wrong way often, historically. And in the article of Chinweizu that you read for today, he gives, let's say, for morally rightfully reparation claims. He gives a lot of examples of that these are, after the Second World War, there are many examples of reparations for restoring wrongdoings, of which, of course, the Jewish is a big example. And then here you can see a list of several claims that are happening and being fought over today. I think a lot of them are not only about money, but also about returning the land that was stolen from people. Land is a very important element for restoration justice, because it puts people really in a debt system that they work on somebody else's land that they do not own. And I think in the UN you could see more and more trends of recognition of colonial crimes. Of course, you had in 1966, there came the International Day Against Racial Discrimination by the UN. This was after the Sharpeville massacre, where there were people massacred protesting against apartheid. Trying to restore this racist system to have an international day on it every year. And there were more and more meetings at the UN how to combat internationally forms of racism. And in 1983 at the General Assembly of the United Nations, where they called for everyone every country to make their own own program to combat racism. You had world conferences. Durban conference, for instance, is a known one. And now you, for instance, have the International Decade for People of African Descent. So these are all, you could say, movements to restore and repair wrongdoings of the colonial past. And there's also been recognitions that slavery has been a crime against humanity. Recently, in 2007, there was also the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there you have a long list of things they recognize as crimes against humanity as well, against indigenous people. and they have the right to self-determination, rights of land are in it, the rights of culture, not being forced to assimilate. So you could see this approach with multiple facets is being more and more adopted and recognized by the UN that these are crimes against humanity, and they should be the influence of these should be stopped and transformed and changed. Another example for indigenous people was, for instance, that 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages, because if you look worldwide, you see, if you look at the map, there's only, if you look at the map, many countries still speak colonial languages, and a lot of the diverse languages that we have today are being suppressed. So you have more than 6,000 languages being spoken worldwide, indigenous languages, most of them. And if you look at the other map with all the small dots, these are all the endangered languages of the world. And there are a lot of them, of course, in the global south. And a lot of them are indigenous languages. And because they estimate that half of all these languages will disappear in the coming 100 years, they have this indigenous, International Year of Indigenous Languages. So these are all kind of measurements and trends at the international level that are quite hopeful. And I think if you looked at the video of Esther Stanford Xose, which is a legal reparations scholar from the UK, and also a Pan-Africanist, and I'll later elaborate more on her conception of reparations. But when it comes to reparations, he says there's 5 key principles to international law for human rights in relation to serious crimes against humanity. One of them is restitution. So basically, restitution means what if the crime didn't happen? What would have been the situation? So you try to restore the situation. So if you had taken land which was not right for yours, then you have to give back the land and restore how you had given it. So if you had polluted that river, then maybe you need to clean it up. Compensation, so basically for the damage done, rehabilitation, if there was any psychological damage, cultural damage, etc., rehabilitate. Satisfaction, the victim needs to be satisfied with what has been given, and the promise for non-repetition. And I think this is the most important one, non-repetition, because I think we're not even there. It's still being, we're still in a perpetual cycle of repetition. And in the optional readings, you could also, I have also included this international human rights law in relation to serious crimes against humanity of the UN. So you can see it's quite an elaborate framework, which can be helpful, and a lot of groups worldwide use these frameworks to gain legitimacy for their voice. I mean, it's not a binding treaty or anything. It doesn't have teeth in that sense, but it does help for recognition and visibility, which has been translated into the UN. Another interesting trend is that you see that nation states are more and more ballsy, let's say. So for instance, 15 countries in the Caribbean demanded for reparations for UK, France, and the Netherlands for crimes against humanity committed during colonialism against both indigenous peoples and people of African descent from chattel slavery. So if you Google, for instance, the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice, they have a whole list of demands that they demand, from these European countries. And so you can also see there, they understand the interdisciplinary. They ask for mental reparations, healthcare, cultural rights, the recognition of genocide, and things like this. And what's interestingly enough, this is ignored. Like if I would go on the Dutch street and ask anyone, did you know 15 countries sued and asked the Netherlands for reparations, they wouldn't know that this is up and running. And I think while a lot of movements are asking for reparatory justice, this is being invisibilized and not discussed and ignored. And I think, and I hope that this will change, that we will start talk more about reparations. But yeah, here and there some hopeful things are happening in terms of recognition. If you see, a lot of the colonial states do not formally apologize, and that is because they know if you formally apologize for crimes against humanity, you are bound by international law to go through all the steps of repairing and restituting the damage done, etc. So a lot of times you will see with apologies, they sort of say, okay, we are very sad what happened, but they won't apologize formally quite often. So now there is there's a breakthrough in the Netherlands that the Amsterdam municipality might actually formally apologize for slavery and the crimes committed during slavery. They said they wanted to investigate if they want to apologize, but first did want to do research. But maybe this year they're going to formally apologize as a municipality, and that would be the first municipality, or let's say, Dutch government institution that would formally apologize on a municipality level for slavery. And the king just 2 months ago or something went to Indonesia, and our Dutch monarchy apologized for excessive violence that the Dutch committed against Indonesia. And I'm not deeply in it enough into what extent the apology of the let's say monarchs has gives way to formal reparations, and I don't think that discussion is on the table, but the recognition is there. That's the point that I'm making. And I think Pope Francis, for instance, from the church, also apologized for the Catholic crimes against indigenous people during the colonization of the Americas. So this is also, I guess step one is apologizing. But there's still a long way to go. I mean, in general, if you look just at the narrative, it's still all about celebration of colonialism, of which the Dutch are often relatively proud of their colonial past. I mean, we had two my ministry presidents, Margaret, last two, both studied history at the university. Both, one said like we should go back to the atmosphere of the golden age, and the other one say we have to go back to the VOC mentality, which is colonial corporation. We have sea hero campaigns and things like this, and I think one striking example of the unwillingness to repair the damage done of the past is I have, for instance, been to the how you call it, the mayor of Amsterdam, together with Afro-Caribbean community, Afro-Surinamese, who have a spiritual religion which is called Winti, which is an Afro-Caribbean spiritual tradition. And this was criminalized during colonialism, one of the many cultures criminalized during colonialism, forbidden for more than 100 years in Suriname. And they asked, hey, there are so many empty churches in the Netherlands. Can we get a church to practice our religion there? They wanted to have a Winti temple, and this hasn't happened till the day of today. So how difficult is it to facilitate and give these people space to practice their culture that has been criminalized? And although diversity, etc., is now, and inclusion is more and more normal in the public debate, reparations is still very sensitive, and I think we have a long way to go to really get there. And now coming to what does reparations mean, right? Because often people think of reparations, oh, you're just asking money, and hey, it's so long time ago, and why would I give money while I didn't do it to you, and you weren't even there, and blah blah blah, right? So this is a very narrow view of reparations, and I think the article, Chinweizu, the article that you read, he describes very well what reparations is about, and he writes, money is not even 1% of what reparations is about. Reparations is mostly about making repairs, self-made repairs, ourselves, mental repairs, psychological repairs, cultural repairs, organizational repairs, social repairs, institutional repairs, technological repairs, economic repairs, political repairs, educational repairs, repairs of every type that we need in order to create an sustainable Black societies. More important than any monies to be received, more fundamental than any lands to be recovered, is the opportunity for the reparation campaign offered us the rehabilitation of Black people, by Black people, for Black people. Opportunities for the rehabilitation of our minds, our mental condition, our collective reputation, our cultures, our memories, our self-respect, our religion, our political traditions, our family institutions, but first and foremost for the rehabilitations of our minds. The most important part of reparations is our self-repair. The change it will bring about in understanding our history, ourselves, and our destiny. The change it will bring about our place in the world. And what I really like is that he also emphasized that repairing is not just giving money, but also self-repair, finding your own dignity back and story, place in the world. And I mean, yeah, it's funny. I remember someone, Sandhu Hira made, for mental exercise, he made a, what if it was about money, how much money would we be talking about? And he calculated sort of, it's a very rough estimate. But what if you would have paid, the colonizers would have paid rent on the land for the improvisers, if they would pay for the goods and resources that they took, like the oil, the timber, whatever. If you would pay a wage instead of having enslaved people per hour, if you compensate people for having an injury when something happened, and pay interest on the debt that you have, because just like Haiti paid interest on the debt, what would they have to pay the colonizing countries? And basically, after his rough calculations, it was 10 times the total colonizers' GDP. So they would have to, for 10 years straight, have to pay every penny that they earn in all the colonized countries together in terms of money reparations. And of course, this is never going to happen, but this gives an impression of what amount of money it's about. And in his book, 20 Questions and Answers about Reparations, he gives, he shows how he calculated this. So yeah, the self-repair first, I already said it. What I really liked about Chinweizu, you can click pause if you want to read the quote, but basically he says here also, if we don't restore ourselves first, we will we will not be able to do reparations. It starts with ourselves. Otherwise, even if we would get the money, we would splendor it through corruption, etc. And I really like this honest self-reflection as well. I think you can hit pause as well if you like to really read this, of PERSOA, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, of which Esther Stanford is part also, of how they conceptualize holistic reparations, but also they emphasize the right of sovereign inherent right to be self-determining. So basically, this having the right to be different than European, not being forced to assimilate, not being forced to be included in the European system, but to be the right to self-determining is a very important part of reparations. So your own language, your own institutions, etc. And I think to wrap my I don't know how long I've been talking, but to wrap up my talk, I think, and to bring everything together, I really like the way Esther Stanford also conceptualized the current time which we were in the Ubuntu philosophy. She uses African words and philosophies as well to make her new concepts which are not Eurocentric. And for her, the past, the present, and the future are not separate. So she analyzed where we are now to put these three together, and she says, well, you had chattel slavery first, then a phase of colonialism, of destroying cultures, and then now a phase of neocolonialism. And they are all went from one phase to another phase. This is the three phases she identifies around colonialism, where she says that, and these three phases, she puts in the word maangamizi, and maangamizi comes from Kiswahili language, meaning Holocaust, something terrible happened, but she uses this word as a continuous process. So it's a continuous process of genocide / ecocide, she says, because the destruction of nature is connected to genocide. And she puts this together, that this whole process of past, present, future, these three phases embodies maangamizi. So she uses this term to describe it, and she says she has a petition that says stop the maangamizi, and we need to go for reparations. And the reparations, meaning all these different facets that we have mentioned before, that were part of colonialism, of the genocidal framework of Trafo Lemkin. And she also put in her presentation, when I followed a masterclass on reparations from her, that says, where scholars deny genocide, they contribute to the deadly psychohistorical dynamic in which unopposed genocide begets new genocide. So really what she tries to do with this Ma'angamisi is make visible the institutionalized forms of genocide that continue to this day. And I think what is really hopeful, maybe, if you look at international law and reparations movement and things like this, is what is really interesting is I would dare to say that if you look at law and human rights, that there has been happening and gaining some reappropriation of rights. If you look at the legal system, they were against and are a lot of times still against indigenous people, etc. But I mean, rights, there is now rights for gay people, there's rights, there's women's rights, voting rights. So you have the rights for indigenous peoples now and things like this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that now a lot of people are using law as an instrument to gain justice, while first law was a way to dislocate people, to steal and everything, to be treated as property. Now laws being used to gain justice. So in that sense, I think the law system is being transformed, and battles are being won every day as well. So I think that is really hopeful for the future, and I hope we can build on this tradition to transform these institutions, so these institutions can be used to defend people instead of disenfranchise people. And I think the article you read on Brown's Promise is also a really beautiful case of how in the US people have been battling against apartheid through the law system, so really using the system against it. And gaining position from that, and there's many cases of this happening. So yeah, that's one strategy or way. People can fight for their rights. All right, I think that's it for today. I have talked long enough, and hope to see you for the discussion. Goodbye.